actually get cold, especially this close to the Sierra Nevada. In Halsey's experience, most folks thought California was made up of Los Angeles and San Francisco, somehow squished together. He expected that was the way people thought about New York, too. Just one big city, an endless Times Square. Not that there were many people left to think about such things, he reasoned. He took a pair of binoculars from a hook and scanned the area, rotating in a slow circle, looking close in and then farther out during a second turn. A short distance from the house was the square of earth he had turned and fenced off in the fall, intending a vegetable garden in the spring, the seeds and tools waiting in the shed nearby. A yellow backhoe was parked beside it, covered in a blue tarp. 200 yards beyond was the mass grave he had dug for the DTs with that very backhoe. To the west and south, the gently rolling hills wore their winter brown and were studded with clusters of small pines. Out past the stables was the airstrip, a long paved stretch with a bright orange windsock hanging limp in the morning mist. At the far end was a blackened snarl of metal, struts and wings and tails jutting out at all angles from where the small FedEx prop job had literally merged with Carson Pepper's private jet in a sudden and horrific fireball that Halsey had witnessed. It had been bad. What emerged from the flames had been worse, and Halsey had been forced to deal with it. Carson Pepper had been Halsey's employer for decades, a multimillionaire who had made his fortune in high-end cowboy boots. Halsey had maintained the ranch for him, and their relationship had been more like friends than business. It had hurt to put the man down. The cabin and outbuildings, the actual ranch part of Carson Pepper's Broken Arrow Ranch, rested in a depression in the valley floor, hidden from view by a long ridge that sloped up toward the big house and crested. A dirt road curved up and around the hill to connect the working buildings to the main property, and a service road headed out to the Skyway, allowing Halsey to come and go with horses and equipment without the need to use the big house's long, brick-paved drive that extended to the highway and ended at gates flanked by stone pillars, each topped with a carriage light. From his tower, Halsey could see black skeletal beams marking the remains of the main house's roof. It had been a spectacular home with vaulted ceilings and walls of glass, 6,000 square feet of luxury boasting 7 suites, marble tubs and granite countertops, 5 fireplaces, a wine cellar, an indoor pool, and a home theater that could accommodate 16 guests. A palace. Halsey had burned it down himself. Satisfied that all was clear, Halsey unslung the .22 and sighted on the dead man below. He waited until the DT moved away from his pickup. Didn't want to put a hole in the Ford if he missed. Then squeezed off a single round to the side of the man's head. The DT collapsed, the report of the small-caliber rifle little more than a pop that wouldn't travel far. The heavier rifles made a sound that carried for miles, so he used them sparingly, mostly for hunting or emergencies. Dolores, still swaying in the yard below, looked up at the shot. "Sorry for this," Halsey said, putting her down with a single round. Then it was time for chores. Halsey got his Polaris Ranger, an oversized quad called a side-by-side with a bench seat and steering wheel instead of motorcycle-style handlebars, a roll cage and a short pickup bed in the back, out of the garage. It looked a bit military, much like a small Jeep, and he liked it for its durability and power. It wasn't particularly quiet, but it could go where his pickup could not and get him back out in a hurry if the sound drew the wrong kind of attention. Halsey wrapped the two DTs in tarps and used the ranger to drive them out to the grave, bringing along a bag of lime and giving them a coating that would not only accelerate decomposition, but keep away animals and others of their kind. He spent an hour splitting wood and carrying it inside, and then did his laundry in an oval-shaped stainless steel trough set beneath a hand pump, once a watering hole for the ranch's horses. An old-fashioned washboard that had once hung on the cabin wall as Western decor was now back in service, and he scrubbed with powdered detergent before hanging his wet clothes on a drying rack inside the cabin. His usual outdoor clotheslines were pointless in this weather. The house had a septic tank, so he had avoided having to build an outhouse, which pleased him beyond description. He could just imagine sitting in a little wooden hut with his pants around his knees when a hungry DT came calling. More time was spent in the smokehouse preparing the last batch of venison he had brought in, and then he did some minor maintenance on the generator before topping off its tank. His chores finished, Halsey loaded the side-by-side with hunting gear, a lever-action Winchester 30-30 and a scoped 30-06. He also added some empty bags in the event he came across anything worth scrounging, a 5-gallon fuel container and a pair of canteens. His .22 went into the rifle rack at the back of the roll cage. His days were routine, and he went at even the small tasks with discipline and structure, always the same. "Unplanned is undone," his daddy used to say. Inside, he packed a small lunch and made sure the cabin was buttoned up tight, triple-checking to see that the generator was shut down and locking the door before he left. The ranger grumbled away minutes later, headed down a dirt quad trail that snaked into the hills to the west. Halsey could have gone out to the Skyway, the 4-lane road running through the valley that connected the 10 miles between Chico and Paradise. There were certainly deer out there, but there were other things as well, dangerous things, and not all of them dead. The trails were better. This trail cut through the hills and pine on a meandering route, crossing several streams and fire roads. The ranger motored past 3 different houses, all summer homes for people from Southern California, all checked off in red on the map over his fireplace. Halsey had already scavenged anything of value. Someone in one of the houses had been a reader, and the ranch hand had scored an entire bookcase of popular paperbacks. Reading was, and had always been, Halsey's favorite leisure activity. Now the houses just stood as vacant reminders of the people who had once thought of them as escapes from the pressures of their everyday lives. After an hour of driving, he saw not a single DT, though he knew they were out there. Halsey came to a particular stand of pines and shut the ranger down, shouldering his pack, the .22 and the scoped 30-06. He walked into the trees for a bit and checked on the salt lick he had set on the pine needles. There were tracks and fresh spoor, so he retreated 20 yards until he found his lawn chair leaning against a tree. He settled down to wait, the heavier rifle across his knees. A nice sight line on the salt lick. It was quiet. It had always been quiet here, of course, but now there was no rumble of jets in the sky, no distant hum of cars on the Skyway or a lonely trucker's horn. The sky still misted rain, and it dripped on him through the pine needles, but he didn't mind. Hunting was part of his work, and work needed doing, regardless of Mother Nature's mood. Halsey had time. An hour passed, the only sound the brushing of pines against one another as a breeze passed through and the drip of moisture from the mist. There was no crunch of needles signaling a cautious doe approaching the salt lick. There might be nothing today, but that was how it often went. Halsey ate his lunch. A foil packet of tuna mix, some chips, and a bottle of iced tea. He missed bread, missed having a real sandwich, and reminded himself to look for a bread maker the next time he was searching houses. A distant boom carried over the hills and through the trees. Halsey slung his rifle and walked out of the pines, looking west. It took a couple of minutes, but he spotted a finger of black smoke rising above the hilltops into the gray sky. He estimated South Chico. Halsey collected his gear and walked back to the Ranger. By the time Halsey settled into an observation point, the wreckage was no longer smoking. He had left the side-by-side on the other side of the ridge and walked the last 100 yards up a deer path, picking a spot near several trees where he could put his back to the hillside, therefore presenting no silhouette, and have a good view of the south end of Chico spreading out before him. Through his binoculars, he could see what was left of the chopper and instantly recognized it as a Black Hawk. Anyone who had ever turned on the news knew what they looked like, but Halsey had seen plenty of them in person. Like many young men in America, he had served a single 4-year tour in the Army almost 30 years ago now. It had been a time when the United States hadn't really been involved in anything more than small brush fire actions around the world, and in any event, Halsey hadn't been a grunt. He was trained as a heavy equipment operator. He had never been in combat, and other than during basic training, he had only fired a rifle during mandatory annual qualifications. He'd spent his entire 4-year hitch driving bulldozers at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. But he recognized a Black Hawk, and if anyone had walked away from that one, it would have been a miracle. He saw no one in uniform around the downed aircraft, but a number of DTs were approaching it from different angles. As he watched, one of them, a woman, wriggled into the cockpit through the smashed windscreen. Another one joined her minutes later. He looked for what might have brought it down, seeing nothing but the empty southern end of the city, its streets populated only with the walking dead. Maybe it had been mechanical failure. A hollow thumping noise caused him to put his binoculars on the south. A dark shape appeared from behind a hill and moved slowly over the Black Hawk's wreckage. "I'll be damned," Halsey said. It left the downed bird behind and came straight toward him, moving slowly as it followed the highway that would lead to paradise. In moments it was gone, its sound echoing among the hills. Halsey ran for the path that would take him to the side-by-side. He would have to cut across to the skyway. Driving the main road wasn't his first choice, but if he had any hope of catching up, or at least seeing where it went, he would have to risk it. The ranch hand's boots pounded the earth as he ran faster than he had in 20 years. Chapter 4. January 11th, South Chico. Vladimir Yurich banked right and angled the Black Hawk over what Angie West declared was the south end of Chico, California. He had cautioned her that landmarks looked different from the air, and sitting to his right in her cockpit seat, Angie had quickly agreed. Now she was navigating from a road map opened across her knees. "We're looking for the Skyway," she said into her radio headset, peering out and down through the windows. "It's a good-sized highway running east into the hills." Vladimir acknowledged and slowed the bird so she could get her bearings. He held at a constant 300 feet. Another voice spoke over the intercom. "We've got wreckage down there," Skye Dennison called. "Looks like another Black Hawk." Skye was dressed in black fatigues and combat gear, a knit cap pulled down over her freshly shaved head. She was clipped into the safety harness near the starboard M240 door gun, leaning out through the opening, and the rush of wind and the beating of blades threatened to drown her out. Vladimir strained to look down through the port windows, but the angle was off, preventing him from seeing the fuselage. He could clearly see the debris field, however, twisted metal scattered across blackened earth. Something had gone down. "Survivors?" the pilot asked. A pause. "No," said Skye. "Looks like only drifters." Angie could see better out her side. "It looks burned. Hard to say how old it is." Vlad nodded. It could have crashed months ago or mere hours. They burned fast, and the smoke would have cleared quickly. He followed the course Angie called, lining the bird up with a 4-lane strip of road leading into the eastern hills. The Russian left the wreckage behind. Back in the troop compartment, Bill Carney Carnes was clipped into his own harness at the left door. He watched the burned and broken bird fade behind them, then looked out at Chico. From up here it was large and spread out, though it was really just a small Northern California city nudged up against the base of the mountains on one side, an expanse of rich farmland stretching out on the other. The center of town appeared to be a grid of tree-lined streets, whereas the south end looked more commercial. There were big parking lots for retailers and small industry, sprawling apartment complexes and residential areas with curving streets. No cars moved along the avenues, but he could make out the small shapes of people. What had been people? Now they were just lifeless, dangerous, rotten shells. It was a little more than 2 hours since their helicopter lifted off from the USS Nimitz, their home now, purchased with the blood of their friends. Father Xavier had stood on the flight deck and waved as they departed. Time had become a strange and intangible thing for Carney now. Could that have only been this morning? It was not so very long ago, he admitted, that he and T.C. Cochran had been cellmates at San Quentin, both locked away for what would probably be the rest of their lives. The plague had granted them freedom, releasing them into a violent and nightmarish world of the walking dead. He thought about their odyssey in the stolen riot vehicle, the horrors they had seen, and the things they had done to survive. Perhaps strangest of all to Carney was that with all the killing since their escape, he, a convicted murderer, had not taken a single human life. He had killed only the dead. The same could not be said for T.C., who up until his final moments had played the role life intended for him, mad dog killer. Even though in the end he had tried to rape Skye and kill Carney, doing enough damage to them both to leave behind a wake of pain and scars, Carney caught himself missing his cellmate sometimes. He would never say it aloud, of course, and he was glad that Skye had put a bullet through the man's brain. But in many ways, T.C. had been like a brother, the closest thing to a brother Carney had ever had. An odyssey indeed, one in which he had chosen to join with and protect others instead of looking out for himself, had stormed an aircraft carrier when any sane person would have run the other way. He had friends now, people who cared about him, and the most unbelievable part of it all was that he felt the same way. And, of course, there was the girl. Carney looked across the troop compartment at Skye, now sitting with her legs hanging out the door and one arm wrapped around the machine gun mount. He couldn't see her face, but knew it would be all business, her normal look. There was another side to her, though, a softer side that could still smile, and one that she had permitted Carney to see. They had been together for a couple of months now, a casual thing with no expectations, nothing that would get in the way of serious business such as this. So he had assumed. But without warning or discussion, Carney had invited himself aboard the Black Hawk just before it left the flight deck. He told himself it was to add some firepower to the mission, but that didn't ring true to him. The ex-con didn't want to admit what he really suspected, that he had come along in order to protect Skye. He frowned, imagining her reaction if he even suggested she couldn't take care of herself. Carney watched the winter landscape passing below and shook his head. He was mooning over a girl, acting like a lovesick kid. He hadn't realized he was so soft. The Black Hawk thumped up the valley, pine-covered hills extending to both sides, the snow-capped Sierra Nevada invisible behind the mist. Beads of moisture raced off the windscreen. "It's about 5 more miles," Angie said from the co-pilot's seat. "Then we're nearly there," said Vladimir. Angie stared out at the gray ribbon of asphalt winding up the valley, leaning forward in her harness and touching the blue teething ring hanging around her neck by a chain. Almost there. After all this time, they were almost there. She didn't notice the ache in her right shoulder where T.C. Cochran's bullet had punched through, didn't notice the throb in her right arm, the bones still knitting together after T.C. had fractured both the radius and ulna. There was only what lay ahead. Leah, 2 years old and away from Mommy for 5 months. Dean, her husband, her rock, keeping Leah from harm. This was the story she had told herself since the outbreak, that Dean and Leah had fled to the family ranch and were now riding out the crisis in safety with her mom and dad. In minutes, they would all be reunited. Angie hadn't yet told her companions that she would be staying, that they would return to Nimitz without her. She silently urged the helicopter to go faster. "I think we're coming up on the turn," she said, pointing. "Up on the left. Slow down and get a little lower." Vladimir eased back on his airspeed and let the bird sink to 100 feet, the wind from his blades thrashing the tops of pine trees. The 4-lane skyway wasn't completely choked with vehicles like the silent graveyards of cars and trucks they had seen during their flight from San Francisco, but it wasn't empty either. An abandoned logging truck a quarter-mile ahead blocked 2 lanes. Pickups and SUVs sat on the shoulders with their doors open, and almost directly beneath the chopper was what had to have been a fatal accident involving an office supply truck and a lime green VW. Several figures wandered past automobiles, a few even reaching up toward the sky as they stumbled in the direction of the Black Hawk. But these were not survivors. Angie was now able to make out the ranch's mailbox, mounted alongside a dirt road that peeled off the skyway and headed north into the trees. The box was bright red and attached to a wagon wheel. "That's the road," Angie said, her heart pounding faster. "The ranch is 2 miles in. We're almost there." Vlad climbed to avoid clipping treetops with the blades and moved slowly up a new, much narrower valley. The dirt road moved in and out of view beneath the pines. In the troop compartment, Skye and Carney looked at each other and nodded, tightening their gear and readying their personal weapons. Their friend was expecting a tearful reunion while they were preparing for the worst. Skye crouched behind the M240 door gun. During the flight, Vladimir had given instructions over the intercom on the weapon's use and reloading. He had even cruised low over some roads and fields where corpses moved, giving his 2 gunners some practice. "Trigger time," he called it. Skye was impressed with the firepower, the door gun chattering, vibrating in her hands as brass streamed out of the ejection port like water from a faucet, falling out and away in the downdraft. The M240 tore hell out of anything it touched. Abandoned cars, asphalt, earth, the undead. Bullet impact threw the corpses to the ground, blew them open, and chopped off limbs, but headshots were rare, accidental, and she growled in frustration. Carney fared no better. Vladimir had told them it was to be expected, reminding them that the weapon was designed for living targets, where a single touch of one of its deadly rounds could exterminate life. It was not a surgeon's tool. It was more like a bulldozer. Now, as the Blackhawks slowly followed the road below, Skye and Carney leaned their mounted weapons out and down. Groundhog 7 covered the 2 miles in short order. And then the trees came to an end, the road moving into open ground as the valley widened to either side until it reached pine-spotted hills. The brown valley floor rolled gently as the road followed a small stream. Angie wore a tense smile as she strained against her harness, the house coming into view. Then the smile faltered and fell. "No," she whispered. "No, no!" Her voice was climbing. "No!" Her hands balled into fists and tears blurred her vision. "No!" she screamed. The Franks' ranch was fenced, a sturdy line of high chain link marching into the trees, but the gate that closed off the property at the tree line was open. Not open, but knocked down and driven across. The house where Angie had grown up, a large 2-story log home with a wraparound porch, was a rectangle of ashes and charred timbers, a blackened riverstone fireplace rising at each end. The stables, the barns, and all of the outbuildings had been similarly burned down. Her father's pickup was black, resting on melted tires, and in what had been the front yard, something was planted in the earth. A post of some kind. A dozen drifters roamed through the destruction, turning toward the sound of the approaching helicopter. "No!" Angie gasped, slumping back into the co-pilot's seat. A small earth mound rose at the back of what had been the house, a heavy steel door set in the side of the small hill at an angle. It was standing open. As the helicopter thumped in for a landing, everyone aboard could see that the ground all around the ranch was torn by tire tracks. Dean's Suburban was parked near the bunker entrance, charred and shredded by gunfire. "Gunners!" Vladimir called over the intercom. "Clear the area!" Using the M240s, Carney and Skye chopped up every drifter within 100 yards, burning through ammo until the bodies were not only down, but no longer moving. Any other time there would be cries to conserve the ammunition, but the gunners at both doors were committed to getting their friends safely on the ground. Rage played a part as well, a reptilian urge to destroy the things they had all come to hate so much. As the Black Hawk's wheels touched down, Skye and Carney unsnapped their harnesses and jogged out from under the turning blades, using their rifles to finish off anything that had survived the airborne fire. Angie climbed out the side door and walked slowly toward the post-like object stuck in the earth in front of the house. Her fists trembled at her sides, and tears streamed down her cheeks. The post was actually a crucifix made from wooden beams, and there was a zombie tied to it. The creature gnashed its teeth, wiggling in its bonds, and let out a long, low moan. Crows had been picking at its face, but it was still recognizable. It was Angie's father. Chapter 5. January 11th, Frank's Ranch. Skye retrieved Angie's Galil assault rifle from the chopper and pressed it into the crying woman's hands, then held her by the back of the neck and pressed their foreheads together. "I'm so sorry, Ange." Angie's body shook with sobs. Skye's hand tightened. "We'll find who did this," she whispered fiercely. "We'll kill every last one of them." Angie shook her head slowly. Why would someone... Skye closed her eyes. I don't know. Behind them, Carney walked a slow circle around the Black Hawk, out beyond the turning blades. The M14 was at his shoulder, and his blue eyes were narrowed, looking out. It was a survival habit he had developed in prison, a necessary skill in the cell blocks that served him well in this new world. When there was a commotion, something drawing everyone's attention, that was the time to look in the other direction. Death's favorite tactic was ambush from behind. The former inmate popped several drifters walking through the fields around the burned ranch. The gunfire made Angie jerk away from Skye. Don't! He could be out there! She grabbed Skye's combat harness in one fist. Did you kill him? She demanded, her eyes darting and wild. Dean could be out there. Did you and Carney kill him with the door guns? Skye stepped back. We only shot dead things, Angie. The other woman held on to the harness, sobbing. I'll help you look for them, Skye said softly. The brown grass was pressed flat in every direction as Vladimir kept the Black Hawk's blades turning, just in case they needed a quick exit, and Carney remained close on security while the two women walked together examining bodies. Angie couldn't look at what had become of her father, groaning and struggling up on his cross, and she wasn't prepared to deal with him. Skye didn't know what Angie's husband looked like, so she stayed close to her friend. There wouldn't be any trouble identifying a murdered little girl, however. Half an hour and a full circuit of the grounds revealed only dead drifters, most of them fresh kills from the door guns, and none of them Dean or Leah. There was also no sign of Angie's mom, Lenore, even among the cinders and fallen timbers of the house. They looked inside the small original fallout shelter her grandfather had built, which Lenore now used as a potato cellar, but it was empty of both the living and the dead. Then they approached the entrance to the main bunker. Why is it open? Angie moaned. It should be sealed. They should be locked inside. Skye didn't have an answer, and she knew Angie hadn't really been talking to her. The door yawned wide, and debris was littered on the ground around it. Some batteries, a can of string beans, a gray sweater, and a gas mask with a cracked eyepiece. The ground outside was pocked with craters, and there were at least 100 shell casings, the empty brass of an assault rifle scattered across the torn earth. A set of narrow concrete steps descended like a throat into the darkness, and both women switched on flashlights. Angie went down first. Daddy is on a cross. He's on a cross. They killed him, and he's on a cross. Her boots scraped on the concrete steps. He's on a cross, and he's like them. Like them, he's dead. Oh, God, my daddy is dead. She felt like screaming. To say the bunker was made out of concrete was misleading. It was actually a series of 8-foot segments made from connected corrugated steel pipe, sealed in reinforced concrete and covered in earth, resting 15 feet below ground. It was designed to be bomb-resistant. The main entrance was the outer steel door, 4 inches thick. That was supposed to cover a long flight of steps leading to a second, inner door, this one as solid as a bank vault and ringed with a rubber gasket to make it gas-proof when it was closed. The inner door, however, also stood open. The design was simple. A long central tube with a raised floor, 2 chambers opening off each of the left and right sides. There were dedicated areas for supply storage, a bunk room, the well pump and water storage, a generator and air handling room, a chamber to handle waste, complete with sinks and showers, and the armory. The bunker had not burned. but it was immediately apparent that it had been completely looted. The flashlight beams threw a cold blue-white light on the central chamber, revealing empty shelves and pallets where supplies had once been. "Why are the doors open?" Angie screamed silently. "They should have been sealed up tight in here. No one could have reached them." A scrabbling, chittering noise came from the well chamber, and the two women advanced, rifles ready as they peered inside with their lights. Some of the blue plastic barrels holding the water supply were still in here, and the motorized pump that serviced the well still looked intact. A dark shape moved low against the floor, peering out from behind the pump motor with yellow eyes that caught and reflected their lights. The baby raccoon darted back out of sight. The women stepped back into the central corridor. The string of overhead lights running the length of the tube remained, but every fuel container had been taken. Pallets that had once held cases of dry goods, clothing, medical supplies, batteries, and flares now stood empty. No longer were there neat rows of toiletries and gas masks, flashlights and hand tools, spare radios and maps. A few clean air filters leaned against the wall by the air handler, but the portable battery-powered TVs and the sophisticated ham radio set were missing. The armory was bare. Empty weapon racks were bolted to the walls, vacant pallets sat on the floor. Whoever had been here had taken every rifle, every handgun, every last bullet. Skye hadn't even bothered to look. She knew it would be empty, and in fact the armory was probably what had drawn the raid in the first place. Instead, she conducted a more thorough examination of the two chambers toward the rear of the bunker, the pump room and the waste toilet facilities. In here, behind the big unit that ground and pumped waste out of the bunker, presumably into a septic system, Skye found a small circular steel hatch mounted in the wall. It had a wheel in the center, just like the hatches on the Nimitz, and a pair of deadbolts. "Ange, come in here," she called. "What's this?" Angie entered the room, knowing at once what her friend was looking at. "It goes to a tunnel," she said. "An escape tube, sort of. You have to crawl on your hands and knees." She squatted and pulled it open, a puff of cold air rushing into the room. A flashlight beam showed that it was dry and very long. The light was swallowed by the darkness. "It travels for half a mile and lets out inside the far tree line." "It was unlocked," Skye said. "It only locks from the inside, right?" Angie frowned and nodded. "I want to check it out. Is that okay with you?" Another nod. "I'll be okay. Don't get lost and be careful." Skye said she would and disappeared into the tunnel, flashlight and rifle muzzle leading the way. Angie watched her go for a minute and then went to the bunk room. She stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, her breathing rapid. Sporadic rifle shots came from outside, muffled by the still-turning rotor blades. Carney cleaning up the dead, she thought to herself. At last she entered. There would only have been her parents, Dean, and Leah. They would have wanted to stay close together, and her mom would have wanted Leah sleeping where Grandma could watch over her. Why are the bunker doors open? Why? Angie passed the flashlight over a room that had been lived in. 4 bunks had tangled bedding, as if the occupants had gotten up in a hurry. She inspected the sheets for blood, found none. Then the beam fell upon a small blue blanket covered in puffy white clouds, balled up in a corner of a bottom bunk. Angie let out a sob and fell to her knees, clutching the blanket to her chest, burying her face in the fabric and breathing in the faint scent of her daughter. Then she began to cry. Skye crawled. The tube was also made from ribbed steel, high enough to pass through on all 4s, but she'd have to leave her pack behind. She didn't want to try to push or drag the pack and handle the flashlight and her weapons all at the same time. Her hard plastic knee pads banged and scraped on the metal. Crawling in just jeans would have really hurt the knees, she thought. And her flashlight beam wobbled across the metal walls. A half-mile. There was no sense of direction or distance down here, so she couldn't tell how far she had gone. It felt like forever. The beam of light swept over an object in the tunnel about 30 feet away and then quickly centered back on it. It was the top of a head, strands of thinning hair clinging to it, gray in the light and lying face down. It reeked, and then it moved. The drifter's head snapped up, yellow eyes and teeth gleaming in the flashlight beam, and it let out a snarl. Then it scrambled to its hands and knees and began quickly crawling toward her. Sky's M4 was equipped with a suppressor, something she had taken from the pile of gear left on the Nimitz by the dead Navy SEALs, but so was the pistol under her arm. She chose the rifle, dropping prone and sighting on the snarling thing, squeezing off a round. It clipped the top of the thing's head, digging out a chunk of rotten gray meat and making a spang sound in the tunnel beyond, but the drifter kept coming. She took a breath, held it a half-second, and then blew it out slowly, squeezing. The 5.56 millimeter round punched a hole next to one of its eyes and blew out the back. The creature flopped limply onto its face. Even with the suppressor, in this tight metal space, the shots had been loud, and she shook her head to clear it before crawling forward. By the time she reached the corpse, she had her knife in hand, and she plunged the blade through what turned out to be a soft, giving skull, just to be safe. Up close, the corpse was pungent, flesh starting to slough off its hands. It had been a man, maybe in his 70s, and dressed in overalls. Not Dean, she was sure of that. Sky bit her bottom lip and crawled over it, her knees and one gloved hand sinking into the fermented rot with a squishing sound. She hurried and was quickly past, crawling faster to get away from the smell, knowing it was now clinging to her. Then she realized it might not have been down here alone, and she slowed her crawl to let the flashlight probe ahead. After what seemed like an hour, a crescent of light appeared in the distance, the far hatch partially open. She still needed the flashlight, but in short order she could see that nothing else had crawled into the escape tunnel. When she reached the end, she found another wheeled hatch, again capable of being locked down from within. The exterior, a smooth steel face painted brown and green to blend with the forest. She pushed it open and saw pine trees all around, a carpet of brown needles underneath. In the light spilling through the opening, she saw something on the curving ribbed steel wall to her right. It was a single word, spray-painted in black. She reached for her Hydra radio to tell Angie what she had found, ask her what it meant, and realized the radio was back with her pack. "Damn," she muttered, crawling out into the forest and straightening, stretching her back for a moment and breathing untainted air. The forest was quiet around her. Then she started crawling back. When Angie finally emerged from the bunker, her eyes were red and puffy, and she was holding her daughter's blanket close. Vladimir had since shut down the Black Hawk's engines to conserve fuel. Angie saw that the Russian and Corny were using entrenching tools to dig a hole in the front yard, a figure wrapped in a green poncho on the ground nearby. The crucifix had been pulled down and was now empty. Angie began to cry again, torn between running at them, demanding to know which one of them had shot her dad, and just curling up on the ground to weep for the people she had lost. Instead, she simply stood near the helicopter and watched them finish digging, then carefully lower the wrapped figure into the earth before covering it quickly. When the dirt was tamped, the men looked at each other, then at Angie. Skye came out of the bunker then, walking to them and taking it all in, telling her friend about the word on the tunnel wall could wait. The pilot, towering over Angie, put an arm around the woman and lowered his head. "I do not have the words. I am sorry." Carney just looked at the sky. Angie nodded, hugged the Russian, then did the same to the former inmate. She looked down at the fresh dirt for a long moment. "I wish Xavier were here. He'd make it better. At least he'd know what to say." She wiped at a tear and blew the dirt a kiss. "Bye, Daddy." They gathered at the helicopter, looking around at the devastation, the burned buildings and Dean's shattered Suburban. No one knew what to say, where to start, but they all shared Angie's hurt. And then a voice called to them from the road leading into the ranch, making them spin and raise their weapons. A man was on the road less than 100 yards away, standing next to a side-by-side green quad. He was simply dressed and wore a John Deere ball cap, a rifle slung over one shoulder. He raised a hand. "Angie West, don't shoot. I'm coming in." Halsey squatted with his arms resting on his knees as if he were about to draw a picture in the dirt. He spat tobacco and looked up with a weathered face at those gathered around him. "It was over by the time I got here," he said. "I was hunting, and it sounded like a damn war up here. I came through the pines on foot." The ranch hand gestured back at the trees and spat again. "I'd been up here a week earlier just to check on everyone. Dean was here with your folks, Angie, and Leah was just as right as rain." He smiled. "Pretty little thing. Your folks asked if I'd had any trouble over at the Broken Arrow, wanted me to pack my gear and bunk with them. Course I told them I was just fine at my place." He looked at the dirt. "If I'd taken them up on the offer, if I'd been here, then maybe—" Angie was sitting in the doorframe of the Black Hawk, looking at the ranch hand, a man just a few years younger than her father, and a man Angie had known her entire life. Halsey worked for Carson Pepper and was the caretaker and general handyman for the Broken Arrow Ranch, but he had often come over to help her dad with jobs around the Frank spread. "It's not your fault," she said. "I'm glad you're still alive." The cowboy nodded, still staring at the dirt, and then looked up. "Same here." "What happened?" Carney prodded. Halsey looked at him. "Everything was burning. The house, the barns, Dean's truck. They were emptying out the bunker, and your daddy was already up there." Angie fought back tears. The family bunker hadn't been the big secret they had all thought. The TV notoriety, the publicity had obviously seen to that, and it had drawn looters. "Dean and your daddy must have put up a hell of a fight," Halsey continued, "'cause there were bodies on the ground, and plenty of 'em. It just wasn't enough. Too many of 'em. And they had an armored vehicle, something from the National Guard, most likely." Angie didn't speak for a moment, and when she did, her voice was low and had a different tone. "Who were they?" Halsey shrugged. "Can't say. Even with the binoculars, I couldn't recognize any of them at that distance. Some locals, I expect. The rest looked like biker trash." The ranch hand looked at the woman whose childhood home had been reduced to ashes. "I wanted to cut your daddy down, Angie, to see him off proper. I feel real bad about not doing it. But by the time the trash left, the dead were up and walking. I was gonna risk it even at that, but then the stampede came out of the trees." The others looked at the man, eyebrows raised, and he spat. "Can't help thinking of them in terms of animals," Halsey said. "A life spent on a ranch and all. When I see 'em walking alone or in pairs, I see them as strays, and they're easy to handle. I call it a pack if it's less than a dozen. And if you're holding the high ground with a good field to fire, they're manageable too. Crowds of 20 or 30, that's a herd, and you're best to steer clear, especially if you're alone." He squinted, his eyes seeming to disappear into leathery creases. "But there's a bigger group out there wandering in the forest." He waved at the trees and hills again. "Got to be 1,000 or more, all staying close and moving together, damned if I know why. When they pass through, it looks like something out of that Kevin Costner